We have Ben Decker and my Shabi. The session is going to be ongoing hostilities, fighting hate and harm. And today we have, I'm going to read from my sheet of paper. We have two experts offering us a glimpse into how we can detect and disrupt the world's worst actors. Maya Shabi is back, at this time with Ben Decker, founder and CEO of Memetica, to discuss the impact of disinformation, the manipulation of payment rails by extremist groups, and trends to watch in this increasingly perilous threat landscape. Ben, Maya, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and take it away.
Hey, Ben, thanks again so much for joining us. So to kick us off, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about Memetica, your passion that led to founding the company and the range of topics that you guys cover.
For sure. And thanks for having me. You know, it's always a pleasure to do these with camera on and recording. So my name is Ben Decker. I founded Memetica in 2019, and we are a threat intelligence group that provides risk advisory services on a number of sort of larger threat intelligence issues, but primarily targeted harassment, violent extremism, and disinformation. So we use a combo of open source and human practices, supporting, a wide range of Fortune 500, 100 on scaled security services, as well as a lot of policy research and some R&D work in sort of the proprietary tech space, because our ultimate goal is really to curb imminent harms and reduce long-term structural vulnerabilities that come from the internet. And just to close on that one, I actually founded the company because I myself had been the target of a major doxing and swatting campaign in 2018 that kind of came from some harassment coming from Russian state-sponsored media and a number of pseudonymous neo-Nazi communities online. And I realized that, my employer was just really freaked out and didn't know what to do. The cops thought I was kind of crazy, as I'm showing them these anonymous message board discussions. And everyone I knew at tech companies just felt really bad for me. So we kind of started the company to just figure out what we can do to work with leading industry partners like EverC on actually identifying, the connection between sort of defining what harm looks like on the internet and what the sort of policy implications end up being on the practical end of the other side.
And I know, like, later on in our chat, we plan on talking a little bit more about the policy aspect of it. But if we can touch on the disinformation side of it, something that you and I had been discussing before is that every few years something unbelievable happens that kind of is a game changer, and we can really see where disinformation, hateful and harmful content circulating in the online arena can have an impact. So, for example, in the January 6th insurrection in 2021, and now as we're experiencing everything surrounding the October 7th massacre, I'm hoping we can kind of zoom out a little bit and discuss these recent examples and where we see disinformation playing a major role on the global scale, or even in conflict zones. We had talked about Russia, Ukraine, for instance, as a starting point. If you want to jump off from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because when we look at sort of tech policies around, let's just call it content moderation, whether that's, extremism and hate speech, disinformation, however we want to or not define that, CSAM, other types of sexual exploitation, illicit commerce, and sort of everything under that bucket. Platforms really struggle with adapting to real-time geopolitical conflict and crises. And ultimately, you have a number of different communities, threat actors, if you will, state-sponsored media entities, extremist groups on all sides who are instantly trying to kind of cash in on the chaos. Some of that means expanding their influence and audience. Some of that literally means selling merch, all of which is generally pushing a number of conspiracy theories, like false flag conspiracies, right? That this attack or thing didn't actually happen. It was secretly coordinated by a group of people pushing a certain goal. There were a lot of Russian disinformation narratives being pushed around, Ukrainian false flags these conspiracies reverberated into the US. So suddenly a number of hyper-partisan and extreme communities online and offline started buying into these, false flag psychological warfare narratives, and downstream, that impacts, American support for, the American government's work to support Ukraine. As recently as October 7th, just hours after the Hamas terror attacks in Israel, those same Russian, propaganda, websites, social media accounts, et cetera, alongside Iranian and Chinese state-sponsored networks, started pushing the same false flag narrative around Israel, claiming, really bogus and extreme concepts of, well, they did this so they could take Gaza. And that kind of delegitimization is something that really percolates like very wide, especially on a platform like, I guess we're calling it X now, but the platform formerly known as Twitter has become extremely rife with these kinds of issues. And for a lot of individual propagandists, influencers, let's just call them, they really rely on a two-pronged process of expanding their audience through outrageous claims, and then cashing in on that audience by selling merch, things like live stream super chats where they take in donations, whether through crypto or otherwise. And so the money aspect is what always kind of follows these widespread, disinformation campaigns that like really just spring out of conflicts left and right.
Well, let's double click on that a little bit about, how these groups garner financial support, the groups themselves, and then, like you said, the people kind of capitalizing off of the situation in order to gain more followers and monetize it essentially.
Yeah, I think, first off, let's double click on that is great. And I'm totally stealing that, by the way. But if we go back to January 6th, we literally 2 months before January 6th, we put out a report with the Global Disinformation Index and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, more or less laying out the ways in which 20 to 30 different anti-government militias, far-right extremist organizations were leveraging a number of e-commerce platforms, fundraising platforms, and really chronicling their history of being, deplatformed or suspended from one and then moving to another, and then finding this kind of underbelly of sort of secondary market e-commerce platforms that maybe didn't have policies in place that fully covered hate groups, right? And I think when the report came out and we spoke to, a number of tech companies, it was, we're looking into this, right? We obviously need to make some changes. Once Jan 6th happens, and a lot of these actual groups covered in the report were inside the Capitol, beating up cops, like many of whom have, convicted members that are currently in prison, all of a sudden you have, without getting into the politics of it, ostensible insurrectionists in a country who are actively using certain e-commerce platforms. So the policies kind of then need to shift a little bit to recognize, like, and I think, at the beginning you mentioned these big sort of moments in history. And what I really liked about some of our, general conversations around this in the past, Maya, is the way that we both kind of see these historical moments as opportunities to test and refine policies, right? When we talk about being concerned about like reducing harm based on X, Y, Z sets of principles, well, now we have those things happening in real time. So how are we doing, right? And these internal report cards or internal metrics, right? It's not a popular thing. No one wants to talk about that, in the public square. And I totally get that. And that makes sense in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it's really good to be able to red team, what exists, to see what slipped through the cracks. Like, how are they circumventing our really well-crafted and executed policies? And so, moving forward, right? Like, obviously, there are a number of platforms now, like Telegram in particular, where a lot of these sort of fundraising coordinations are happening. And sometimes it's just, I am this militant group trying to get funds for whatever the perceived cause is. Please help us, right? And in other times, you have international transactions taking place between, let's say, neo-Nazi groups in Australia and the US and Canada. So you have three countries where financial transactions are going on. In at least one of those countries, one of the groups involved is recognized as, a terror organization. Even if it's something benign, like a Christmas toy donation, how is something like that treated, right? Like, do we just look at that transaction as a singular incident around a benign topic? Or do we look at the historical context of each of these groups? What are they doing outside of this individual transaction? And to what extent do those things factor into some of the decision-making that takes place?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in particular, with the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, we've seen a lot of reports about fundraising efforts through crypto or virtual assets. And we've seen it with other global threat actors through investment schemes, and like you mentioned, small scale merchandise sales. So what are some things that those in the payment space can kind of adapt? Or like you had mentioned before, we have to learn from the past and apply some lessons as we move towards the future in kind of trying to reduce or eradicate this hateful online behavior.
Yeah, I think there's some really valuable or helpful best practices and lessons that are starting to come out of the social media space, ironically enough. And it first started 2018, maybe, with Medium, the blogging service. It's a pretty small platform if you think about the user base compared to like a Facebook or Twitter for that matter, and also a lot less money and no ads. So in order for them to figure out a trust and safety policy, their rule was, if you violate platform terms of service on another platform, we will then take action against your account on this platform. Discord now is getting a lot of really positive press coverage, and I think rightfully so, over their new trust and safety policies, which are also very cross-platform in nature. So if a user is suspended on Facebook, we're going to understand why, and then we're going to take, responding action against that user on Discord. So I think for payment providers and platforms, there's the internet has a lot of things happening, and we have a lot of correlating data points between individual users, entities, organizations. So determining what kind of shared intelligence can happen with other tech companies or outside vendors, frankly, for that matter, to understand, like, we have a bunch of users who are, I don't know, stoking race war riots in X place. A payment provider or platform, there's no reason that they would know about any of that when, the activity and behaviors are purely transactional and might look very normal to, anyone looking at the data. But if, you have almost like this knowledge panel like that pops up in Google search, kind of, where it's like, actually, here's a little blurb. This group is responsible for XYZ things. 5 people have been arrested for, violent assault of minority groups in this place. And in addition to all of their racially charged and violent content on social media, they're inserting fundraising links to, connected to your platform, or they're trying to get people to buy t-shirts using this, third-party e-commerce plugin. Those are the kinds of things where there's no reason to be able to have the complete picture unless there is some work that's being done to get feeds of intel that are relevant and actionable. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it's that interconnectivity and that partnership to, like, in my mind, it's like building a case against a user or an organization caught engaging with this activity. But, the last talk that I had with Dr. Hashemi is that it's, the internet is a crazy place. As soon as you take a website offline, another one pops up. Same thing with user behavior. We play this game of whack-a-mole of, okay, we've been able to track, Discord is very admirable where they have a user that's posted some kind of content that violates their terms of service or acceptable use policy. So that gives them the ability to take them off of their platform. But what's stopping them from opening a different profile or going somewhere else and kind of jumping all over the place? So it's really a combined effort to try and match that online behavior with their payment rails, transactional data, and what are they actually doing in order to generate funds.
Yeah, I mean, we're like, and I think this all speaks to, right, like the internet is a very large floor of Legos, right? Like they can actually all come together to create something, but most of the time, right, it's just splattered all over the place. And we have seen a lot of that, and I think some really big concerns about like federated spaces, like Mastodon and others, where you have these basically individually moderated servers with minimal like outside visibility. It just kind of speaks to the increased like distributed nature of the internet. Like on one end, right, we have this aggregation of app on app on app, right, to make our lives more easy and organized. And on the other, you have this like splitting of the DNA strands further and further out. But I mean, and these are some conversations that, like, look, I think for payment platforms, I don't know to what extent there is involvement or participation with like GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or like CTED at the UN, or frankly, signing on to or participating in the Christchurch Call, the New Zealand and French government initiative to sort of end violent extremism online. I know, like, we are a member organization and we see huge value in being able to share intel, as are some other commercial entities like us, but also like this is a space for the platforms to ask questions, try to share things and close private Chatham House rules areas and figure out like what is helpful in a less costly, oftentimes free means of basically getting a lot of this information. And nothing is perfect by any means, and a lot of work is required to make these viable hubs to support industry. I just think payments has a big opportunity to kind of astroturf in a very good way some of the collaborative progress that's being made, at least around violent extremism.
So touching back on, you were talking about the Christchurch Call and kind of these policy efforts from that perspective. Do you see the trend kind of moving towards, say, web hosting policies as we see those DNA strands kind of divide even further, kind of targeting those web hosting and how people can, hide certain content or have it be password protected or whatever else to try and zero in on that harmful content?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the future of all this. I want to say it was 2 years ago, Brad Smith from Microsoft, who signed on to the Christchurch Call, like at the very, very beginning, talked a lot about the stack in terms of the totem pole of internet service providers. Like, on the bottom, you have like maybe some of the platforms themselves. On top of that, you have the cloud hosting providers, the domain registrants, and kind of everything sort of that goes into it. So in theory, if AWS or Microsoft Azure makes a policy decision, everyone else who uses them then has to comply. Otherwise, they might not have their cloud hoster anymore. So I think sometimes those are in areas where it's like, look, we're as a company not sure what to do here. Maybe the industry as a whole, if we can all get some consensus on this, then we're comfortable making a decision. Well, it's like, who is the shared, right, like cloud hosting service for all of them? Let's just all talk to them, let them make a decision, and then that can kind of trickle back down. So I think it becomes a two-way policy street in a lot of ways, because ultimately, right, like even individual companies like Cloudflare that get, I mean, a lot of flack for the types of entities that are able to have websites registered through there. They also make some very valid policy decisions around where their lines are, and I think they are in some ways less affected by others in the sort of stack of policy decisions. And there's so many different case studies that one could sort of pull from, but it helps to create a blueprint for alignment, I think.
No, I can get that.
But it's a blueprint. It's not like anything more than that.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Well, and so if we can kind of get a little bit into your research or about far-right extremist groups in the US and how you guys were able to contribute to very important research, following January 6th, what are some of the things that we're seeing trend online, connection to current conflicts, and how do we see that playing a role ahead of the 2024 election?
For sure. Look, I mean, I think some of the payment platform related research we've done, there's a couple of papers in a series called like Bankrolling Bigotry. Look, before January 6th, they were just kind of interesting, research papers on the way that these groups use, extremist groups use payment platforms in the US. And I think in a sense, it was very important to start to establish and define, like, we all collectively agree, I think, around the world that like ISIS should not be able to have like a merch store that's right, like, and that you can pay through like anything, right? Like that's a no-no. But what about groups who don't fit the same geopolitical, ethnic, religious sort of molds or anything like that, who participate in, what we now know was an armed insurrection and an attempt to overthrow the US government? Or what if it is a group that regularly threatens and intimidates with firearms civil society groups, particularly the LGBTQ plus and transgender communities, right? Like, what do we do about that? So from a practitioner or researcher standpoint, we do the research. Let's see what things look like. Let's look at what is happening offline and, tee up, offer a determination to the stakeholders who make those decisions and make those policies. I think we're in a very privileged view to be able to do that kind of work. We just, have, I think, through these experiences over and over, I think the pandemic and George Floyd in and of itself, or the hybrid pandemics of racial inequality and COVID, was another opportunity to understand like different stakeholders in tech policy, in government, in law enforcement sometimes. What is the unified like language we can speak? How can we effectively communicate without too much jargon so that everybody understands, like crystal clean graphs, like court ready, evidence in terms of like social media data, other data, metadata that comes along with it, the ethics of how to properly manage this, comply with GDPR, California data privacy, and everything that's coming on the pike. It put us in a position to have a templated approach to mixed methods research on kind of near real-time violent extremism. So one of the things after October 7th, we got ready to put out a big report that we published last week with the World Jewish Congress about the Hamas social media campaign that ran simultaneously in tandem with the terrorist attacks. And I think what's been really concerning about that, and in one sense, state-sponsored, influence networks across the board that we've spoken about all started pushing like a lot of these claims. But I think, like, most concerningly, far-right groups, not just in the US, but around the world, who are virulently and violently anti-Semitic, are not just cheering on Hamas for killing Jews, but they're also looking at them in an aspirational capacity and trying to understand their guerrilla warfare techniques that they may adopt for lone wolf attacks in the US. And, in 2022, there were two members of an anti-government militia in the US called the Boogaloo, who were convicted of, supporting foreign terrorist groups because they met with someone who they believed to be a Hamas official in the US and offered to make them auto sears, silencers, and other 3D printed weapons parts that would then be, taken back to Gaza. So in a sense, like, these small edge cases or things that felt like really far out and concerning, but were just edge cases back in 2022. Now suddenly, well, if they continue to distribute and circulate not just, pro-Hamas content, I'm talking about like extremely violent and graphic videos that are being praised in the ways that people used to do so for ISIS content or for Christchurch mass shooting videos, like real extreme glorification of horrific violence. And that's, one of the things that some of these groups, they do use a lot of e-commerce, right? They're the ones selling merch and the like, and the majority of them have been forced into much more fringe financial ecosystems. And I'm not even talking about like just crypto, like Gab, a fringe alternative to like Twitter. They have their own payment system. I know it's probably attached to something, but look, in a lot of ways, like, payment platform policies have actually forced a lot of folks outside of the the public park. So things are working. They have been working. That's a really good sign. Now, they're getting creative. So on our side, we're getting more creative in how we think about it. And I know that, Maya, that's something that you guys obviously spend a lot of time doing.
Yeah, following that trail of those social media trends and the specific verbiage and keywords that they're using, the propaganda they're circulating into the rhetoric. And you can see, just like the examples that you provided, how it can have that impact into groups that you wouldn't have even expected, groups that are very familiar with weapons, that show up armed to their demonstrations and such, and why it's so important to disrupt it. I could keep talking about this for another 3 hours. I know we're at time, which is why Melissa's come back on camera.
This has been an outstanding session. I think that the discussion, the learnings that you have both shared have been amazing out to the audience. I think I think one of the most important things that you touched on was the idea that when a tragic event happens, the threat nation state actors come in and manipulate the scenario. And we need to stay really strong in our resolve in being shoulder to shoulder to fight that, to acknowledge it, and to force accountability out to broader social media platforms, and to continue fighting the financial gain of hate networks. We're going to win. I promise you that. You guys are awesome. Stay strong, keep fighting, and I'll see you in the next session. Take care, guys.